everyone, and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So, in the next couple of videos, we are going to dive into chapter 17, which talks all about connection and interhemispheric connection. So, in this video, we are going to talk about what is structural connectivity, what is functional connectivity. We're also going to shed light on 3 different types of connecting fibers. We are going to talk about the biggest piece of brain structure that connects our 2 hemispheres, which is the corpus callosum. And then we will talk about John's Downer monkey experiment and Liebman's theory of apraxia. Okay, so let's start off with brain connectivity. So as you all know by now, neurons and brain regions communicate to one another. And this communication can be either direct, where a neuron of one brain region literally synapses on the dendrites of a neuron in another brain region, or this can be indirect, where 2 brain regions have another neuron or another brain region in between their communication. So an example would be the communication between the medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So the hippocampus has direct neurons, so direct communication or projections to the MPFC. However, the MPFC does not have any direct return projections to the hippocampus. So it has been shown that the MPFC will project to this little nucleus in the thalamus in the midline called the nucleus reunions. And then those neurons in turn will project back to the hippocampus. So it basically closes the communication loop. So there is direct connectivity from the hippocampus to the medial prefrontal cortex, but the medial prefrontal cortex communicates indirectly with the hippocampus through the midline of the thalamus, the nucleus reunions. So we can divide brain connectivity up in 2 sorts. So we have functional connectivity and structural connectivity. If you lesion or cut a cerebral connection, so a physical structural connection, you will have a disconnection. And then in the next couple of videos, we will talk about what happens if you have disconnections between your 2 hemispheres. But for now, let's start off with the definition of structural connectivity. Structural connectivity is a network of physical or structural connections linking neurons or sets of neurons or neuronal elements with one another. So you have a direct physical brain matter connection. These connection or pathways are often they are white matter pathways, and they exist of axons, is there white matter. So why do you think this connectivity is considered white matter? Okay, you got it right, because these axons are surrounded by myelin, which is a fatty substance, and it is more white in color compared to the gray matter, which is the brain matter that has more cell bodies. Okay, so structural connectivity is the same thing as anatomical connectivity. So this is literally the physical connectivity of axons from one brain region to the next. And to look at this connectivity in humans, we use diffusion-weighted imaging. In this method, we measure the water molecules in the brain and their directionality, but we'll talk a little bit more about this in a later slide. So in animals, you can actually measure the connectivity using tracing studies or using little viruses. So you can inject retrograde or anterograde tracers to follow where the neurons come from or where they're going. So in retrograde tracing, tracer injections are done in the synapse and then followed to where the point of origination happens. So that will be the cell body of those neurons. And then the other technique, the complementary technique, is anterograde tracing. So here you trace axonal projections from the cell body to the synapse. Okay, let's move on to functional connectivity. So functional connectivity is a temporal correlation between activity of different brain regions. So this measure is often used in functional magnetic resonance imaging or fMRI. So functional connectivity is operationally operationally defined as the temporal correlation between time series of different brain regions. So this doesn't mean there is a direct structural or anatomical connectivity. This means that brain regions are working together at the same time. So, for example, if you have a memory task and your medial prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus are active at the exact same time scales, this might mean that these brain regions are working together during this task. Okay, so anatomically defined cortical lobes each engage in a wide range of cognitive activities. So, for example, the temporal lobe appears to play a specific role not only in vision and audition, but also in more complex cognitive functions such as memory and language and emotion. So, although these cortical lobes engage in kind of like different cognitive activities, they overlap remarkably in function. So, for example, multimodal frontal lobe cells, they can respond to visual or auditory, somatosensory, olfactory, and even taste inputs, but they also additionally participate in functions such as memory or language and emotion. So, the lobes have, they kind of all work together and they have a lot of overlap in function. So, they have to work together very close. So, by its very nature, all these networks and overlap implies connections, right? So, in the next couple of videos, we will go over what will happen when you cut connections between two hemispheres. Okay, so if you cut a cerebral connection, this is called a disconnection, and the ensuing behavioral effects are called disconnection syndrome. So disconnection syndromes is the behavioral effects of a disconnection. So the behavioral changes that result from disconnecting cerebral regions can be very, very odd, and they often differ from behavioral changes you might expect when you lesion two areas and the connections are still intact. So it's very different if you cut the connections or if you cut out a specific area. Okay, before we dive into the disconnection syndromes, let's talk about different types of connecting fibers in the brain. So we have three types of connecting fibers. So we have association fibers, we have projection fibers, and we have commissural fibers. So association fibers are fiber bundles that connect neocortex to neocortex. So we have long ones and we have short ones. So here in this image, so these are association fibers. Or, for example, if this region is connected to that region, that's an association fiber. And then we have projection fibers. These are fibers that ascend or descend to or from the neocortex. So these fibers would be projection fibers. They will go up to the neocortex. So this is the neocortex. These are subcortical. And here these projections go descend or they ascend. Okay, and then we also have commissural fibers, and these connected to hemispheres. So, for example, here, these fibers over here, these connect the right and the left hemisphere. So the biggest one is the corpus callosum. Okay, so we have long and short association fibers. So these are the long ones. So for example, the visual cortex and how it's connected to the frontal cortex, that would be a long association fiber. And then we have these tiny short fibers. They will connect adjacent neocortical areas, and we also call them U fibers because they look like little U's. So cute. Okay. And then the projection fibers, we just talked about that. They connect neocortex with subcortical gray matter or brainstem or even like spinal cord. For example, a connection of the medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus would be a projection fiber. So the MPFC, or the medial prefrontal cortex, is a gray matter neocortical structure, and the hippocampus is a subcortical structure. So projection fiber will connect those two up. So here in blue and in purple, you see the projection fibers. And what was this fiber? That's a commissural fiber. Okay, so the commissural fibers. Okay, so we have, they connect to two hemispheres, and we have three main ones. We have the corpus callosum, which is the biggest one. And you can see that in green in the picture on the top. So right here, so this is a brain cut in half, and this is what the corpus callosum kind of looks like. We also have the anterior and posterior commissure. So here you can see the anterior commissure right here connects, this is the right hemisphere with the left hemisphere, and the posterior commissure also connecting the right and the left hemisphere. So in this image, this is a coronal view. Here you see the anterior commissure. So where do you think the posterior commissure would be? Right behind it. So if you go further, deeper into the brain, the posterior commissure, as you can see right here, is right behind here. So basically, these three fiber bundles connect the right and the left hemisphere to allow for communication between the two hemispheres. And this is very, very necessary because we talked about all this information that crosses, for example, motor information coming down and our visual system, how it crosses over. So these commissural fibers are really important. Okay, moving on to the corpus callosum. So the word corpus callosum comes from the Latin word callus, which means hard body. And this connection is made up of about 200 million to 800 million fibers. And for example, our body movements require this interhemispheric cooperation. So we have to be able to balance on one leg when we lift the other leg up. So a prominent working hypothesis concerning callosal function is the zipper hypothesis. And according to this hypothesis, the corpus callosum kind of knits together representations of the body's midpoints and the central space that are divided by the longitudinal fissure. So callosal connections appear to fall in three general classes. Most callosal projections are topographic, so they connect to homotopic areas, which are identical points in the two cerebral hemispheres that are related to the body's midline. So, for example, your right primary visual cortex and your left primary visual cortex, or your right premotor cortex and your left premotor cortex. So those are kind of in the same area in both hemispheres. And then projection zones within a hemisphere also maintain close relations with homotopic zones on the contralateral hemisphere. So for example, your primary visual cortex, or your V1, is connected to your V2, not only within a hemisphere, but also in the contralateral hemisphere. So V1 sends projections to V2, both ipsilateral and contralateral. And then a group of projections has a diffuse terminal distribution. So this is possibly to alert appropriate zones in one hemisphere that the other is active. Okay, so in this image you can see the patterns of the commissural connections between the hemispheres of a rhesus monkey. So in red you see the areas that are connected through these commissural connections. So as you can see, the occipital lobe does not have a lot of red, but definitely some of it is connected to the other side. But a lot of the V1 is actually devoid of any interhemispheric connections, except for that part representing the midline of the visual world, which we also call the visual meridian. So in functional terms, V1 represents the visual world topographically, and there is no need for one half of the representation to be connected to the other. So as you can see, The motor and sensory areas for distal parts of the limbs, aka our hand and feet, also lack commissural connection. So maybe this is because they need to work independently of one another. And among the areas that do receive commissural connections, the density of projections is not homogeneous. So cortical areas that represent the body's midline have the most dense connections because those areas have to work together the most. Okay, so the location of projections within the corpus callosum is also very, very specific. So here on the bottom, you can see a schematic illustration of this pattern in a monkey. I believe it's a rhesus monkey. It's very schematic. The anterior part, as you can see right here, this is the anterior, this is the posterior. So the anterior part of the corpus callosum is called the genu, and genu means knee. So just think of knees in the front, genu. And the genu contains fibers projecting to the prefrontal cortical areas. And then you have fibers through the body of the corpus callosum. Proceeding from front to back, they project from the premotor, motor, somatosensory, and posterior parietal, as you can see right here, posterior parietal cortex or cortices. And then fibers at the posterior end, which we call the splenium, project from the superior temporal, inferior temporal, and visual cortices. So the anterior commissure is way smaller than the corpus callosum and connects parts of the anterior temporal lobe, amygdala, paralimbic cortex of the temporal lobe surrounding the amygdala as well. But as you saw in a couple slides back, the anterior commissure AC and the posterior commissure PC are way smaller compared to the corpus callosum. Okay, and this was the end of this video, and I will see you guys back soon.